Before this video begins, spoiler warning. I know this is a 15-year-old TV show, but this video will contain fairly major spoilers for the episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender that aired on Nickelodeon between 2005 and 2008, and also Silence of the Lambs. A few years ago, I rewatched Avatar: The Last Airbender for the first time in quite a while. It had been years at this point since I watched the show. As a point of reference, the last time I watched this show, I was fighting with my big sister to do so because she was constantly deleting my recordings, and episodes were flanked on either side by commercials for pillow pets and this monstrosity. But then I found out about the sequel show, The Legend of Korra, which my love for the original show led me to watch pretty much immediately. And don't get me wrong, I liked that show a lot. I know not everyone did, but I gotta say, my overwhelming thought leaving that show was a desire to rewatch the original. Now, if you're like me, this is actually probably a pretty unnerving thought. This was one of my favorite things as a child, and we all know that revisiting childhood media properties often ends with, fairly disappointing results. I had such fond memories of this show that I had actually decided at one point, I'm never going to watch it again. I don't want to run the risk of ruining that show in my head. I liked it so much as a kid. I don't want to take a chance on not liking it as an adult. But, of course, this wouldn't be much of a video if I did not break that vow. And I mean, honestly, if you were to take a super surface level, uncharitable look at the show, I think you could miss what's there. There's child-oriented humor and story beats, and even these sort of spastic animation styles at points that are reminiscent of other child-oriented shows that don't hold up as well as Avatar, to be frank. But also, it does not take much investment in this show at all to realize there's a lot more there than just a dumb show for kids. What makes this show so great, and what I like to think made me like it as a child, is the incredible respect and attention to detail paid to basically every character in this show. There are very few one-off characters, and even when they're there, they're really contributing something really important to the story, and they're not just sort of dull NPC-like characters just giving our protagonist a piece of information. And of course, that's not even to mention the main characters of the show, every single one of which I think is strong enough to carry the show on their own, but when they're all combined, they make something brilliant. So let's talk about my favorite character, Azula. I think I'm in pretty poor company here, and it wasn't until I did a bit of research for this video that I found out most of the other people who share my love of this character are expressing it in the form of images that would get this video demonetized if I showed them. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but for the most part, it does seem like most of the fans of the show aren't exactly eager to cut Azula any slack. Just as an example, currently while I'm writing this, and hopefully while I'm recording it still, the most upvoted post in the r/The Last Airbender subreddit is a post explaining that Azula's flames are blue, not because of any particularly interesting firebending prowess, but because she is a salty bitch. I think this is a bit of shame. I always liked Azula, even as a child, but to my great regret, I have to admit that when I was first rewatching the show, I did kind of forget that she was in it. Then, about halfway through the first season, Azula made an appearance, literally just standing in one shot behind Iroh in a flashback. But it did pretty much immediately remind me why I liked the show so much. It's most likely just a coincidence, but the show really does seem to take a turn for the better around the first time we see Azula. The Fire Nation goes from a slightly kooky but an easily escapable threat to like a serious problem that you don't want to mess with. Iroh goes from little more than comic relief to a spiritual leader who commits treason in order to keep the world in balance. Katara and Aang actually start waterbending, and that's not even to mention the second season, often regarded as the best of the show, where Azula first gets some real screen time. This is the point where Avatar really becomes Avatar. There's still the child-oriented jokes, but it doesn't even matter. The stakes are real, the character work is amazing, the storytelling is phenomenal. I went from watching 1 or 2 episodes a night to finishing the whole show in like 2 days. So it didn't take long until I arrived on the final episode, which opens with Azula's fate. When watching this scene from the series finale, if I'm being completely honest, I felt a little bit betrayed by the show. Having now had a bit more time to reflect on this, I don't actually think that Azula's ending is unfair or unearned, but we'll get back to that in just a bit. For now, let's just focus on the fact that the completion of Azula's character arc exists in stark contrast to that of her peers, or for that matter, any other character in the show. The most obvious candidates for comparison here are Mei, Ty Lee, Zuko, and Iroh. All of these characters are Fire Nation citizens, and like real Fire Nation citizens. They aren't just passive observers of an authoritarian regime. At one or more points during the course of this show, every person I mentioned contributed to advancing the Fire Nation's place in its quest for global dominance. But all of these characters eventually ended up with a very Nickelodeon ending. All eventually betrayed their upbringing and joined the good guys. Iroh helps take back Ba Sing Se with the White Lotus, Zuko becomes the Fire Lord. Mei and Ty Lee both betray Azula and help political prisoners escape in Boiling Rock. In the end, every time we see one of these characters, they're smiling, with the exception of Zuko, who, the last time we see him, is visiting his father in prison just to set up a 4th season for M. Night Shyamalan to ruin it and make sure that would never happen. But even speaking of Ozai, he gets a pretty Nickelodeon ending. He's in prison, yeah, sure, but he's alive, despite all the reasons he shouldn't be. Aang actually bent over backward to find a way not to kill Ozai, and in doing so sort of risked the entire world's last-ditch effort to stop the Fire Nation from total domination. But the last time we see Azula, she's chained to the ground, sobbing, screaming, shooting blue flames out of her mouth, and having a full-on mental breakdown. It's a striking image, to the point that I think my initial guttural feelings about the ending may have just been a result of the imagery used here. Not that it's super relevant for what anyone else would think, but I've got a pretty long-standing phobia of seeing people in handcuffs, or straitjackets, or having their movement restricted in any real way. The first time I saw Silence of the Lambs, I was rooting for Hannibal Lecter's escape, not because I thought he was innocent, it was just the first time 10-year-old me saw someone in a straitjacket, and I wasn't a fan of that. Of course, in that case, it actually kind of worked in my favor, but here, all we're left with is the fairly haunting image of a 14-year-old girl chained to the ground, losing her mind. Formerly, one of the most powerful and feared characters in the show, rendered completely powerless by circumstance. If I had to guess, this was put into the show to make people feel uncomfortable. I don't think the showrunners wanted the audience to watch this and feel like it was a just ending for the character. I think they were trying to say a little bit more than what's on the surface. So let's track this a little bit further, starting with Iroh. First son of Azulon, and the first in line to become the Fire Lord. Iroh was as committed to the Fire Nation's mission as anyone else, but basically the whole time we spend with Iroh during the course of the show, he's a tea-loving senior citizen who's concerned exclusively with the well-being of his nephew, Zuko. Iroh joins Zuko after he's banished from the Fire Nation and continues to stick by Zuko's side, even after being betrayed multiple times throughout the course of the show. But there's far more to Iroh than what we see in real time. I think we can pretty easily assume that Iroh lived the majority of his adult life not brewing tea and cracking jokes, but in the same way as his younger brother Ozai. Both grew up brainwashed by their father and entered adulthood doing everything in their power to help the Fire Nation win dominance over the rest of the world. Iroh was the Fire Nation general. He spent his time slaying dragons, conquering cities, and undoubtedly killing many innocent people along the way. Iroh even enlisted his own son, Lu Ten, to fight in the war. There's actually a really telling flashback in the second season where we see Azula, Zuko, and their mother Ursa all laughing at a joke Iroh made in a letter about burning Ba Sing Se to the ground.
I hope you all may see it someday. If we don't burn it to the ground first.
This may seem like kind of a small detail, but Iroh making this joke seems to suggest to me that, at least in his worst moment, Iroh is as committed to overtaking the world as anyone else in the Fire Nation. It wasn't until after the death of his son that Iroh ever takes a step back from his upbringing, at some point visits the spirit world, at another point joins the White Lotus, and at yet another point returns to the Fire Nation, presumably as a changed man. But even then, Iroh doesn't just start leading a secret rebellion. He really doesn't do much of anything. Iroh still sits on war council meetings, even inviting Zuko to the meeting that inevitably leads to his banishment, and continues to stay, at least in appearance, loyal to the Fire Nation. It's not until General Zhao forces his hand by threatening to throw the world out of balance that we ever see Iroh take any action that is an overt defiance of the Fire Nation. Zuko, of course, grows up in a remarkably similar environment. He's brainwashed from the day he's born to believe in the Fire Nation's mission for world dominance. Everyone around him expects Zuko to help lead the Fire Nation and is committed to this one cause. Ursa gets a lot of credit for being some kind of anti-Fire Nation Trojan horse, but from what we see in the show, she's just not. Ursa is a good mother, it would seem, at least to Zuko, and seems to take the war much less seriously than everyone else around her, but we never see her or anyone else openly question any of the goals of the Fire Nation in any of the pre-Season 1 flashbacks. Iroh does eventually betray the Fire Nation and heavily influences Zuko to do the same, but not as like a resistance fighter or anything. Iroh is much more interested in setting up a tea shop in Ba Sing Se and pretending the war doesn't exist like the rest of the city. Of course, Iroh does eventually realize this isn't an option and makes a real effort to convince his nephew of the truth. But even then, Zuko is still not receptive to this new way of thinking. Zuko straight up betrays Iroh again, and this time ends up getting him locked up in a Fire Nation prison. Iroh, being Iroh, still doesn't give up on his nephew. He continues to communicate with Zuko, continues to try and change his opinion, and eventually Zuko defects. And to his credit, when Zuko does break, he breaks hard. Zuko goes from learning the truth to battling the Fire Lord over an afternoon, and goes from a loyal Fire Nation prince to an insurgent, infiltrating a Fire Nation prison and freeing resistant fighters in, like a few weeks? So maybe it's not all that surprising that Zuko's very fervent betrayal of the Fire Nation, no matter how suddenly it happened, very quickly influenced his girlfriend Mai and Ty Lee to do the same thing. What's important to note here is that no one, not Iroh, not Zuko, not anyone else, flipped allegiance because it was the right thing to do. Every one of these people had a guide who showed them the error of their ways. This really shouldn't be all that surprising because, among other reasons, almost all of these characters are children. It's very easy to forget about this fact when we're in a fantasy world where all of the main characters are minors who are not only capable of but expected to save the world by the adults around them, and it's only more difficult to track when you consider that Avatar is far from the only fantasy story where this particular element exists. But the main characters here are just kids. Aang is the youngest at 12, technically 112, but fuck off, and Zuko is the oldest at 16. Every other member of Team Avatar and their Fire Nation rivals live somewhere in that range. Azula falls directly in the middle at 14. I think it's important to keep this fact in mind and reset our expectations accordingly before we take a look at Azula. Azula's story most directly parallels that of her brother Zuko. They're both raised by leaders of an authoritarian regime, both brainwashed since the day they were born, both fire. There's a lot of similarities between the two. The first real difference that we observe between Zuko and Azula is in their early skill level with firebending. Azula is pretty naturally gifted when it comes to firebending, while Zuko has, let's say, a bit of a more humble start. Both do end up becoming undeniable firebending masters and end up having one of the most epic battles in the show, but in the beginning, Azula has a bit of a leg up on Zuko. This results in an odd dynamic between the siblings' parents. Ursa really buddies up to Zuko and is constantly comforting him when he fails, while then Fire Lord Azulon and soon-to-be Fire Lord Ozai quickly take a liking to Azula, as they view her as a sort of a firebending prodigy. So while Zuko has Ursa and Iroh to mentor him, Azula gets stuck with Ozai. Ozai, of course, I think is objectively the most overtly evil character in this show. He uses his nephew Lu Ten's death to try and steal the throne from Iroh, and when that doesn't work out the way he wants, he just kills his dad. To be completely clear, it's not like we know of any other factors leading up to that decision. Ozai is brainwashed by his father, sure, but we never really see him resent that or take issue with that. Ozai clearly respected his father enough to name his daughter after him, but then the first time his dad gets in the way, he just offs him. Ozai is not a great guy, but he's the only person we ever see giving Azula any kind of affirmation. Ozai seems to be the only person who treats Azula not like a monster, but like a gifted warrior who can contribute to the world around her. That descriptor, Azula being a monster, is one that she's very quick to self-apply herself. So I have to imagine that it's absolutely consistent with the way that she views herself. So it stands to reason that Azula would be naturally very receptive to anything she's told by the one person in the world who very clearly does not believe that to be true. And if I can go off on a bit of a tangent, which I can, it's my video, I don't think Azula is a monster. A lot of people point to this flashback of Azula manipulating her mother to force Zuko to play with her so that she can prank him, or this other one where she burns a doll Iroh sent her as a gift, as an example of Azula being some kind of cold-blooded, emotionless firebending machine, but I don't buy that. I've never known a child who didn't try to play games of wit with their parents to get their way. I certainly did, and Iroh gave Azula a crappy gift. I don't think there's many people watching this video who've never gotten rid of or failed to appreciate a seemingly pointless gift given to them. The one example that actually holds some ground in my head, at least, is the first time we see Azula in the show. Here she's watching, smiling on, while her brother is being abused and banished by her father. That's pretty rough, but it's also just really aggressive schadenfreude. Azula and Zuko are undeniably rivals, and it's not crazy to get some amount of satisfaction watching a rival fail. Hell, we even see Katara getting satisfaction this way during the course of the show. So I'm just not convinced that one or two mistakes are evidence of anything deeper. Also, and and I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, Azula is still just a kid. And I suppose that's really the crux of my argument here. This is less about the specifics of what Azula did or didn't do under the direction of her father or other people in the Fire Nation, and more about free will. And if you're thinking, random dude on YouTube isn't qualified to be theorizing about free will, you're right. You're right to think that. There's some well-qualified scientists and philosophers that I'll point you to in the comments section, but what I'm really talking about here is just the acknowledgement that, up to a certain point, people, especially children, aren't necessarily always behaving at their own behest. Free will is something that, even if you believe we all absolutely have at some point, doesn't come installed by default. Even in America, with its antiquated criminal justice system, if a 14-year-old were to just murder someone in cold blood, that person most likely would not end up in a prison. We put them in a detention center specifically created for minors, ideally intended to be much more about rehabilitation rather than punishment. This is a well-established and well-accepted, though often unwritten rule about the way that we all acknowledge the human brain works. To make it as simple as I can, and bring things back to Azula specifically, you can't change your mind if you don't know that changing your mind is even an option. Not only is Azula mentored by, and only ever given affirmation by, the most heartless and brutal character in the show, not only is she constantly encouraged by her surroundings to, if you will, behave badly, she's never given the opportunity to change. Every other firebender in this show is guided by someone else. They don't just turn their back on their upbringing and join the good guys of their own fruition. But Azula never gets that push in the right direction, or if she does, we don't see it on screen. You could make the case that Mai and Ty Lee changing sides at Boiling Rock was a sort of an invitation for Azula to do the same, but at least to me that reads much more like a straight betrayal than anything else. Also, keep in mind the number of times that Zuko betrayed Iroh before he finally joined Team Avatar in the end. Iroh practically had to hold his hand and guide him through the entire history of the Fire Nation before Zuko finally bailed. Just imagine a version of the show where maybe Lo and Lee, for example, act as Azula's Iroh. They'd be oftentimes silent, but fairly constant guides to the truth. I, for one, would like to see how Azula would react in that kind of a scenario, but you know. So I sat there for a while watching Azula lose her mind, chained to the ground, and I think it felt a real sense of disappointment towards the showrunners. But then it occurred to me that maybe the writers weren't just trying to give a middle finger to fans of Azula, but were trying to say something a bit more profound about real life. See, there are plenty of media properties like Avatar with really well-developed characters in the world right now. It almost seems like we're spoiled in this regard. But one thing I've noticed is that oftentimes when writers and producers and directors and actors and everyone else puts in the work, fleshing out characters, making them real, there's a very strong temptation to make sure that everyone has a good, happy ending. That's fine. I don't have a problem with tacking an extra 30 or so minutes onto the end of Avengers Endgame so that we can see resolutions for all the characters that aren't immediately going to be in a follow-up future project. But this being the norm, it does make it stand out when a show like Avatar doesn't do that. Don't get me wrong, most of the characters in Avatar get a very happy, very Nickelodeon ending. Almost everyone is hitched up with someone else or in some other way living their best life. But I can't help but think that if someone like Kevin Feige were producing, we'd have a whole 20-minute extra episode where we just floated around and watched every character in the show get exactly what they wanted and get every storyline wrapped up with a neat little bow. Avatar is a different beast in this regard. The showrunners were fine with leaving a decent amount of stuff up to the imagination. They left plenty of things implied, but not seen, and ignored the urge to give us answers to every little question that might have cropped up during the show's runtime. Now, to be fair, this could just be because the showrunners were hoping for a fourth season, and therefore were happy to leave some things up to imagination because they were counting on needing to keep a few storylines open for further exploration. But the resolution of Azula's character makes me think a bit different. See, the thing about creating realistic, barely true-to-life characters that people can relate to is that the characters have to be realistic. Not everyone in life is going to get a happy ending, and I'm not just trying to be a nihilist, that's just a fact. I'm sure even the world's most prolific optimist could think of an example of someone who just didn't get a fair shake. Azula was absolutely brainwashed by her father, and though she controlled people around her with fear, it's not unreasonable to assume that she lived her entire life in fear as well. Azula's life and the conclusion of her story is unfair, but so is life for a good amount of people. That's not to say that it's not a tragedy, or that I'd be upset if the show had given my favorite character some other fate, but maybe ending this character's storyline the way that the show did was the most honest thing the writers could possibly do. Also, just in case you were wondering how Azula ended up being 9-year-old me's favorite character in the show, I don't know how she wasn't everyone's favorite. She's one of the villains, sure, but she's also one of the most skilled, if not the most skilled character in the show. Fights everyone head to head, almost never loses a fight. Cold, calculating, outsmarts everyone in the show at least once. She can fly, she can firebend blue fire, she shoots lightning out of her fingertips, but not after years of training as a middle-aged firebending master at 14. Also, isn't fire obviously the coolest element to be able to bend? It's cool to be able to kick around some sand or play in the water, but, call me when an airbender can do this.